All right, pros prefer primes, but it's got nothing to do with sharpness, and your zoom's probably better than you are. Today, I'm gonna break down what makes a good lens great, and why you probably don't need to go spend $1,000 on a brand new lens. So, let's get into it. Hey everyone, my name is Sergio, and I'm a commercial photographer here in Victoria, BC, and this 90mm Canon Prime is as old as I am, and that zoom lens, the one that's filming me, is as old as I was when I started photography. Both of these are fine, and the latest and greatest new tech does nothing to tell my story that these don't. Before we get too deep into today's video, I want you to keep in mind that the gear you currently have is more than most likely enough. Over the last 10 years of my career, I've always preferred primes. The first lens I ever bought myself, much like yours probably, was the Plastic Fantastic Nifty 50 1.8. It was before I charged for anything. I was, still taking in as much of the craft as possible. But I thought, hey, this lens does something that my kit lens doesn't. It has to be better. Look at all this bokeh. But in reality, what was so much better about this lens wasn't its technical ability. It was its inability to zoom. Its inability to let me be lazy with my composition. A prime lens, something like this, forces you to zoom with your feet, or I guess in this case, the tripod. It forces you to move closer or further from your subject, but let's be honest, it's usually closer. Now, why is that important? It's important because it forces you as a photographer to really understand the field of view and, most importantly, the compression of the lens you're using. Every focal length has a very unique set of characteristics, some that you just don't pick up when you're zooming from 28 to 42 to 95mm. You might be thinking, oh, I can shoot a scene with a wide lens and just crop in and it's gonna look the same as a zoomed in prime. But when it comes to photography, lens compression doesn't change when you're cropping. When you shoot with a 24mm lens, your lens has like this field of view, and it keeps going in that direction indefinitely. So that's why close objects look closer and far objects look even further. Now on the other extreme, when you're shooting with a telephoto lens, that field of view becomes much more narrow and straight down. And sure, sometimes we just don't have the room to back up and we need a wider lens to get the shot. But understanding the compression of a telephoto lens and the relationship of each pixel that it's neighboring with, that's gonna help you understand that even zoomed in at 24mm, those pixels are gonna be further away, so to speak, from each other than if you were just shooting it with a 100mm lens. Are you trying to create a distortion and a funky reality that exaggerates some of the characteristics of your product, your model, or your architecture gig? So pick a wide lens. But don't go zooming into your overhead flat lay and expect that all the lines are gonna stay straight. I'll show you an example of that in a little bit, but shooting with a more zoomed in lens allows that relationship between the elements in your photo to feel closer, because those pixels aren't as stretched out from one another. Are you shooting portraits at the foothills of a mountain range? Use a telephoto to bring those mountains closer to your subject. You want to isolate something in a tight space, but make it look big and grand? Wide lens. The idea is to have the ability to understand the right focal length that you need for the story that you're trying to accomplish. Not pick a lens because you read online that it would be sharper. Now on that note, let's talk about that sharpness. Let's talk about the technical ability of a lens and what makes a lens great to begin with. This logic that primes are sharper than zooms is taken from the 70s and the 80s when lens manufacturers had less quality control from one product to the next product. And zooms were considerably more complicated to manufacture, not to mention heavier. However, that's not to say that the same lens manufacturers haven't, figured it the hell out, as if the lens you got 2 years ago is somehow obsolete. But that's what they do. But with that same logic, if a lens from 2012 far outweighed the iteration from 06, and now one shattered the 96 version, it's easy to see that it's all a ruse. Well, let's say like 90% a ruse. There is a very slow evolution of technology when it comes to the features in a lens. But if this one is sharper than that one, which is sharper than the one before it, at a certain point, the lenses are just sharp. It's good, it's fine, it works. You don't need to spend $3,000 for a different mount, just get an adapter for your old lens. A 24-72-8 is a 24-72-8. Sigma, Sony, Canon, Nikon, version 1, version 2, whatever. Just get the one that fits your budget. Your picture is not gonna be better because you have less purple fringing in the corners when shooting wide open. Your picture is going to be better because you spent less money on lenses and more on practicing your actual craft. So let's take a look at a few examples. If you check out these two shots with my 24-105 zoom compared to the 90mm prime, both at 90mm f8, tell me you can tell the difference between the two. Here, I won't even put up the answer on the screen to know which one's which. I'll just ask you right here. Which one do you think is the 90mm prime? Both lenses behave differently. Sure, they don't have the same contrast and color rendition. They don't look identical from one to the next. But they're both razor sharp, and they're both able to tell the same story. At least until I get into the special features of this lens. But when you look at these pictures side by side, it's really tough to tell a difference. I think it's important to have a zoom so you can experiment and see, what focal lengths the majority of your winners really fall on. The focal lengths that you seem to shoot and be most comfortable at. Everyone's is different. And then finding those primes that exhibit those specific characteristics that you like in your photography. Not because they're sharper, but because they allow you to think of your images with a sense of compression and storytelling, not big front elements and bocaliciousness. So let's go back to this setup here and shoot a couple new examples. All right, so I've got this set up over here with the 90mm, and I'm gonna use the 24-105 that was filming this and zoom it into 90 to try to get some comparison shots. So let's see here, if we take our first shot, we see it's beautifully sharp. Gorgeous image. So that is at f11 on the 90mm. So next up, let's shoot this with the
Stunning first part of the race for Michael Schumacher.
24-105 here. Do a little lens switch. I come in here and zoom that right up to 90mm. Back in my day, we didn't have a little scale on our cameras that said 90mm. We just had to kind of guess. All right, let's try this shot here. Just to show you guys the difference between the 90 and the 90. Looks like the 24-105 has a slightly more zoomed out approach to what a 90mm is, or maybe the 90mm is a little bit more zoomed in. But that's, give or take millimeters. If we zoom in, you'll see that, definitely side by side, the one down here being the 24-105 and the one up here being the 90, definitely a lot more contrast in the 24-105. But I think that's more to say that the 90 is very flat. I've noticed that from the very first shot. I noticed that the images come out very, almost like you're shooting in log in video. They're very flat, but that doesn't mean that you can't add the contrast back in. If anything, it just gives you more detail in the shadows. But in terms of sharpness, your guess is as good as mine. They both look identical and totally fine to me. When you start pixel peeping and you start looking at two different images side by side, it's not comparable to the real world. So it's not as useful as you might think it is. If they're both sharp, then that should be all you need. Now let's try a shot at 24 and we'll zoom in and I'll show you guys how, I'll show you guys how different it comes out when you zoom in to 90 instead of, here, let me just delete this guy before it gets annoying, instead of the regular 90. So let's just try to make a similar crop here. Oh, big difference, huh? So if we take both images side by side, and now if we zoom in, obviously we're taking an entire image at 24 megapixels, or we're taking a tiny little segment of an image at 24 megapixels. So if you just look at the detail in the pineapple, it's night and day that the zoomed in version is not as good. It's not that it can't get you there in a pinch, but it's definitely a big difference. When you start looking at the depth of field as well, because you're cropping into a 24mm lens, almost everything's going to be in focus, even at f11. Whereas when you're shooting with the, or at 90mm, you start to get this much more defined background. Even if you look here on the edge of the paper, this one here is a lot sharper because we're zooming into a 24mm field of view. The 24mm is very hard to create depth in your background and in your environment. So that's another reason that shooting with a wider lens and zooming in is probably not the ideal way to go. So that's 24 zoomed in. That's 90. And now let's just do a few more examples. We'll shoot them at 2.8 and just show you the difference. Or I guess f4. So that's at f4. Now we're gonna turn this guy off. This is the 90 mil at f4, and let's just go back in 88, boom. Boom. So now, if we look at both images side by side at 90 mil and at f4, let's have a look at some of their comparisons. Oh, 90 mil did not focus properly. All right. Again, now zoomed into f4, you can see that both of them, honestly, side by side, pretty identical. I honestly can't tell a whole lot of difference other than, again, that contrast and color rendition. But when you look at the sharpness or the out of focusness or even the compression between the strands of the pineapple, it looks fine. It looks totally fine to me. The only thing I would say is that, you know, the 90 mil does have additional features that this 24-105 doesn't, and vice versa. This one's got autofocus. This allows me to get the shot no matter where I am because the story is ultimately more important than the technical of each shot. But with this one, I do get to go up to 2.8 instead of f4. And there also is the tilt and the shift function, which we'll get to in next week's video. Until then, guys, I hope you learned a couple tricks in today's video. Maybe leave a like on your way out. I'll see you guys next week. Later.